The gender gap for women in the workplace is much wider than previously thought. That's according to a new report by the World Bank, which looks at laws and policies that still stand in the way of gender equality. Trumbic is one of the authors. Thea, what's the most surprising thing about your research?
Well, thank you for having me here to present to you the newest findings of the Women, Business and the Law 2024 report. The most surprising thing was that the gap is much wider than we previously thought. So this report is the 10th edition of the Women, Business and the Law report, brings a lot more information to the table. So we are adding 2 new indicators, one on women's safety and one on childcare, and going beyond the law and measuring not only the legal frameworks, but also mechanisms to implement those laws and perceptions of outcomes. And when we look at this new set of data, we find that the women only have 2/3 of the legal rights afforded to men, which is much higher than we previously thought. It's a much higher gap than what we previously measured. And many countries where we previously gave them 100, meaning that they had all the legal provisions needed, now not even one country has a perfect score, which means that there's a lot of room to improve, in particularly on these 2 new areas that we've added.
Okay, maybe you could elaborate what that concretely means. What does this gap mean for women, and how does this translate to gender equality in the economy?
Of course, yes. So, laws on the books are an important first step, but without proper implementing mechanisms, they will not achieve the outcomes that we intend. So, for example, we've been measuring equal pay for equal work for more than 15 years now. But we know that women all over the world still there's a gender pay gap when it comes to the pay that they're receiving. So one of the things we're looking at this year is, are there pay transparency mechanisms? And even though 98 countries currently guarantee and mandate equal pay for work of equal value, only 35 countries have pay transparency mechanisms that allow those rights to translate into the attainment of equal pay for women. And when we surveyed our experts and asked them about their opinions, equal pay is one that we haven't really seen achieved anywhere in the world. And so one of the things that we're trying to really emphasize is that it's important to write strong laws that legislate towards gender equality, but it's also important to invest in the institutions and systems that implement those laws, and then to also understand, are those outcomes being achieved that the law is intended to achieve?
Right, and when it comes to women in business, your report concludes that across the world, women hold just 1 in 5 board positions, that 94 countries are lacking provisions to give women the same salary as men for the same work, and that women are earning 70 cents on the dollar compared to men. These are frustrating numbers, but they also seem familiar. Is the situation getting worse or better?
Well, I think we're getting closer to the truth. We have seen that change is possible, and every year we talk about the reforms that countries are putting in place. This year we recorded 18 countries putting in 47 reforms, and in particular, those reforms were in the area of pay, removing job restrictions, also increasing access to parental leave for parents and fathers in particular. And so we know that these laws can be changed, and we're putting more information on the table. We're raising the bar on what should be done because we haven't seen the outcomes track the progress in the law. But we can only manage what we can measure. So by measuring these areas and providing this information, we hope to raise awareness of what can be done in the law, what can be done beyond the law, and how we can track progress that men and women are making around the world. So one really important thing that we're adding is looking at sex disaggregated data, which is largely lacking. So it's really difficult. The numbers that you shared, are based on what we know, but there's still a lot that we don't know about how women are doing, both as employees and entrepreneurs. So we hope by empowering them through the law and encouraging mechanisms that support the implementation of those laws, we can make sure that these rights are realized and not just written.
Going by what we do know, we're seeing a surge in authoritarianism around the world, whether that's in Russia, China, or in Hungary, here in Europe, for example. What's the state of gender equality in authoritarian states compared to democracies?
Well, as I said, all countries have room to improve according to our new measure, but we do see that, for example, countries that have higher incomes are performing better on the legal areas, and not much has changed from what we were measuring before. We don't necessarily split our analysis into those areas that you mentioned, authoritarian versus democratic, but we know that women can stand to gain in all countries around the world, and especially in the area of women's safety. Gender-based violence is something that is particularly harmful during conflict, and we know that all around the world, now that we're measuring this, very few countries legislate issues like femicide or child marriage. And in fact, even sexual harassment is something that is increasingly legislated in the workplace. So we see 151 countries today prohibit sexual harassment in the workplace. But when it comes to areas like public spaces, education, and online, we see very few countries legislating that. And those are all areas that are very important for women and where they do show up. And if they are not safe, then they're less likely to participate in the same way that men can.
Now, Germany is one of the 14 countries in your study that grants women the same legal rights as men, but it's also one of the countries that has the most room for improvement in their supportive frameworks on safety. What does that mean concretely?
So Germany did score 100 on our previous methodology, but now with the addition of this indicators in safety and childcare, Germany actually scores 85 out of 100 on our legal index. This is still quite high compared to other countries, and it's in the top 25 countries around the world. But the area where it's really lacking is in safety. So there is no laws prohibiting child marriage or femicide, and the law on domestic violence does not account for economic or financial violence. So in the law, those are areas that could be improved. In the supportive frameworks, this is an area where it scores 82.5. So there's a lot more to be done there, and this includes having action plans on gender-based violence issues, also legislating and thinking about women and gender issues when it comes to public transport policies, and thinking of gender-sensitive criteria when it comes to public procurement. So those are areas on the supportive side that could be improved.
Your report also shows that most reforms to increase legal gender equality were undertaken in sub-Saharan Africa, which is ahead by far. It's followed by the Middle East and North Africa, and then Europe and Central Asia. How come sub-Saharan Africa is ahead when it comes to making changes?
Well, historically, sub-Saharan Africa had the lowest score, so they had the most room to improve, but they have been systematically tracking and changing these laws. And so we see this year, Sierra Leone and Togo among the countries that improved the most. And these are countries that have been reforming consistently in the last 10 years. They have been changing their labor codes and their civil code and family codes. And this has come from a concerted effort of both civil society organizations in the country, international organizations, and a commitment from the highest levels of government to improve gender equality, because they had a long way to go. And this year we see Togo scoring almost 100 on the legal score, according to our old methodology. And that's because they have really taken the women, business, and the law indicators and looked where their laws were lacking and made those reforms. And those reforms took a long time to implement. It's not something that was done in a year. We're measuring it this year, but it's a result of a very long process.
And your research also shows that in 28 economies around the world, a woman cannot pass her nationality to children in the same way as a man. I'm wondering, how does that impact a woman's economic situation?
Well, if you think about the fact that many women have children, if they're not allowed to pass on their nationality to their children or their spouses, for example, that might mean that those children and their spouses don't have the same rights in the country. That could limit their children's access to education or healthcare. And so this might force them to leave the country and not be able to stay in their own country. And we see this as a big issue for women, and particularly in some parts of the world, where they are limited in how they can participate because they have had a child or married a foreigner in their own country. And so this is one of the issues that we're tracking for the very first time this year, because it's been raised as an issue of economic mobility for women.
Right. And staying on the topic of birth of children, South Korea recently announced it had a birth rate of just over 0.7 children per woman. That's the lowest in the world, but not by much. If governments now begin to try to increase birth rates in their countries, what effects could this have on gender equality?
Well, I think that this does not have to be a sort of something that has to be against gender equality. But systems have to be put in place, both paid parental leave, but not just for mothers, also for fathers, and appropriate childcare facilities that are high quality and affordable and available. So this is one of the issues that we are measuring for the first time this year and looking at what kind of childcare is available for parents. And we have been tracking whether paid maternity and paternity leave exists. And we've always claimed that you cannot have equality in the workplace unless you have equality at home. So it's true that many women are choosing not to have children, or families are choosing to have less children, because sometimes it is a financial issue for them. If childcare is expensive or not available, then one parent needs to choose to stay home with the child. And so this becomes an economic issue, but it can be solved with appropriate childcare facilities and paid parental leave that would then not discriminate against women.
Thea Trumbic, thank you so much for speaking to us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.